Hugh White, have you taken the St. Augustine position on nuclear weapons? Give me chastity, but not yet. Give me nuclear weapons only where the need is very clear and there is no alternative.
Yes, I think that's right. I'm not quite sure that's a correct interpretation of St. Augustine's theology, but it's a correct interpretation of my approach to nuclear weapons. I find the thought that Australia might contemplate acquiring nuclear weapons pretty appalling, actually.
And there's a lot of theology in this.
There's a lot of theology in it, and one of the challenges we have to recognise is that there's so much about nuclear weapons we don't know. So much of what we understand about nuclear weapons, or we think we understand about nuclear weapons, comes from studying the Cold War. And the Cold War was a very particular case study, very particular contest between a very particular pair or set of adversaries, very particular geostrategic circumstances, ideological platforms, and so on. And so it may well be that the future of nuclear weapons is going to look pretty different from what we think the past looks like. And we still don't know how nuclear weapons will factor into the way in which powers, great powers, middle powers, relate to one another in the decades to come. But it does seem to me that there's at least a possibility that it's going to be very difficult for a country like Australia to achieve the core strategic objectives of a middle power, being able to stand up to a great power without the backing of another great power. It's going to be very difficult for us to do that against a nuclear-armed adversary which can circumvent our conventional forces by threatening us with nuclear blackmail. And so if that's true, then, and further, if it's true that the only reliable way to circumvent nuclear blackmail is to have the capacity to threaten retaliation yourself against a nuclear attack, and that appears to be the lesson of the Cold War, then Australia may well find itself in a position that it will make no sense for us to invest 3.5 or 4% of GDP in conventional forces if we don't also invest in nuclear weapons. And so we'll face a very stark choice between being essentially an unarmed and neutral power on the one hand, or a nuclear-armed power on the other. Now, I'm not sure that's the dilemma we'll face, but one thing I am sure of is that we'll have to reconsider the issue, because what's made it possible for us to just dismiss the idea of nuclear weapons in the past, in the 50 years since we took part in the negotiations for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, is our confidence in US extended nuclear deterrence. It's been easy for us to say we don't need nuclear weapons because America had nuclear weapons and we were sure the Americans would use their nuclear weapons to defend us. If I'm right about the trajectory of US strategic primacy in Asia, even if you're much more confident than I am about the trajectory of US strategic primacy in Asia, you still have to recognise, I think, that the chances of America still performing that function, being willing to accept the costs and risks to them of extending nuclear deterrence to us 30 or 40 years from now, is much lower than we've expected it to be in the past. And that means that we have to ask ourselves again, what are the risks and what are the costs to Australia of acquiring or not acquiring nuclear weapons? And in order to help nourish that consideration, inform it, I do in the book try and take the argument a step further and say, well, if we think we might need nuclear weapons, what sort of nuclear weapons would we need? What would we need them for? What does that mean about the kind of forces we need? Now, it's only a relatively short chapter. It only touches on these issues, but I do think its aim is to help people understand this question, understand what will be involved. I'm a very long way from advocating that Australia should acquire nuclear weapons or predicting that we will. What I am predicting is that if and as US leadership in Asia declines, if and as we find ourselves trying to make our way strategically in a region of competing great powers that are nuclear armed, we will have to reconsider for ourselves whether or not we need nuclear weapons ourselves. And what I'm trying to do is to at least begin the analysis of what that might mean.
You've sat in the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Outline to me that debate where the National Security Committee of the Australian Cabinet decides that the costs and the benefits of Australia going nuclear are such that there is now a need that is clear and there is no alternative.
Well, it's a really good way to think about it. What would have to happen for that conversation to take place and for that conclusion to be drawn? Well, the first thing to recognise is that although Australia has rhetorically always been very committed to nuclear disarmament, so to speak, as an abstract international good, it's also been the case that the people who took the decision for Australia to sign the NPT back in the late 60s, early 70s, and those who were charged with reflecting Australia's implementation of it, at least in my own experience, right up through the 80s and into the 90s, always kept in the back of their mind the thought that, well, this works for us now, but it's possible in future that might not. Now, famously, Bill Hayden, for example, who was Foreign Minister for so much of the 80s, and a very effective and committed advocate of disarmament and arms control and non-proliferation, has written that he himself always thought Australia should keep that option open. Now, I don't want to accuse generations of Australian political leaders of hypocrisy, but it was never the case that the bedrock of Australia's commitment to non-proliferation was a high moral principle. It was a prudent strategic judgment, which was prudent in the strategic circumstances of the time. We have been absolutely right to do that. So what would have to change? Well, I think there are three things that would be really significant. The first is the trajectory of US strategic commitment to Asia. If there are clear signs that America's strategic presence in Asia is slipping, then this issue will become more acute, or you could put it the other way around. The clearer the signs are, the more acute it becomes, and the more likely Australian governments are to consider this seriously. And you don't want to over-scenarioise these things, but it does sometimes help to reflect on history. You know, the credibility of British strategic commitment never really recovered from the Suez crisis in '56. But it was the declaration of the withdrawal east of Suez in 1968 which really rocked Australians back on their haunches and said, okay, we can't depend on these guys. And a combination of an east of Suez type affair and in the context where you had the sort of Suez crisis type situations, I think could easily really undermine Australian confidence. And the second point is who else gets them? And remember, we're not alone in this. A lot of countries in the region, a lot of countries around the world signed the NPT on the basis of their confidence in US extended nuclear deterrence. And for all of them, and for some of them much more acutely than us, particularly if you look, for example, in our own region, at the Japanese and the South Koreans, I mean, this is a really front and centre issue for them.
So for us, Japan and South Korea really are tripwires, aren't they?
They are.
For this debate.
They're the canaries in the mine to slightly change the...
They are the pit canary in terms of the alliance as well.
Well, that's right. And so, you know, if we see America's alliance with Japan failing, for example, which I think we easily could, I think the alliance is inherently much more fragile than one thinks, and I mean, Trump's behaviour in Osaka tends to confirm that, then I think we have a very important, as I say, canary in the mine on that. And if the Japanese decide that they can no longer trust the United States and decide to go nuclear themselves, that changes the context for Australia's decision making. And equally, of course, if countries closer to home, if Indonesia, for example, makes that calculation. And it is worth bearing in mind that I have been perhaps unusually blunt and stark in spelling out the implications for Australia's nuclear posture of what's happening in Asia at the moment. But every country in Asia is facing the same issues, and I suspect is thinking about the same things. And the third element is what happens to the other powers in the region. What do we learn about China's strategic intentions? What kind of power China aspires to be? What we learn about the way India projects itself? What we learn about the kind of country that Indonesia becomes, whether it starts to act like a great power and what kind of great power it starts to act as. And I don't expect we'll face this decision this decade or even next decade. I think it's a longer time frame decision than the decisions on conventional capability that I'm talking about elsewhere in the book. So I don't think we need to rush. We don't need to be the first. And I would in fact argue strongly against being the first. But if we see an Asia in which Japan has gone nuclear and South Korea has gone nuclear and Indonesia is considering its options, then whilst I still think it would be a tragic and very difficult decision, and I'm still not sure what the answer would be, I am sure that we'd find ourselves considering the issue much more seriously.
Australia has drawn huge benefits from the fact that ASEAN has embraced a non-nuclear approach. The Southeast Asian decision not to go nuclear has been a huge benefit to Australia. I put it to you that even if South Korea and Japan went nuclear, the benefits that Australia draws from that Southeast Asian approach, particularly from Indonesia, would mean even then it would be a hard argument to say that we should go nuclear before Indonesia, say.
Look, I think there's a very compelling argument for that. I think that is absolutely an issue you'd need to take into account. And the more confident you were that Indonesia wasn't going to take that step, the weaker the arguments would be that Australia should take that step. So I very much agree with that. But I do think we have to be cautious about how confident we are about continuity in Southeast Asia. The fact is that, the ASEAN we know and love, and it has been very beneficial for Australia, is itself an artefact of the long era of uncontested US primacy. That ASEAN has been able to flourish as an association of middle powers, dedicated to keeping themselves free of major power influence. Over the decades since the early 1970s, in which there ceased to be major power competition in Asia. China accepted America as the primary power in Asia when Nixon went to Beijing in 1972, and he continued to accept it right up until probably 2011, I think is the date where that changed. When they abandoned Biden-Hyde and started overtly challenging American leadership. And now, of course, that challenge is absolutely overt. And what we see happening as a result is that as those two great powers compete, and India's in the game as well, then those great powers do what great powers always do. They reach into the middle power groupings and try and pull them apart and pull them one way and another. And that's what we've been seeing with, Cambodia and Vietnam and the Philippines and so on. Now, they'll fight back against that. I think Lee Hsien Loong gave a really outstanding speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year, in which he was saying to both the US and China, but very pointedly to the US, we don't want another Cold War in Asia. We've been here before, we remember what it was like. But I don't think that's going to stop it myself. And that being so, I think we have to be realistic that ASEAN is going to find it hard to hold together, if only for reasons of geography. With the best will in the world, Vietnam is never going to have the same set of equities and priorities in relation to China that Indonesia will. Geography alone tells you that. One has a land border with China and the other one doesn't. So I think ASEAN is going to become more diffuse, more contested itself. Indonesia has a huge challenge as to how it defines its own security interests in an era in which it doesn't benefit from US primacy being uncontested. And I think we will be dealing most probably with an Indonesia which is either very different strategically or is useless strategically. I find it very hard to read Indonesia's strategic future. But if it's going to play a significant strategic role, it's going to be very different from the Indonesia that we've got used to really since the introduction of the New Order in the late 1960s. So I just say we shouldn't be too confident that we know the direction Indonesia will head in. And if, as I say, Indonesia adopts a more forthright strategic personality, then for them too the question of nuclear capability will come to the fore. What the historians may judge is that the period since the NPT was established in the early 70s, by and large, very successful constraint on proliferation might prove to have been a historical moment that doesn't last. And not just here, of course, the same could well be true in the Middle East and in Europe.
So you are a man saying we should not have nuclear weapons unless a lot of very bad things happen.
Yes, but a lot of very bad things could happen. Even then, as I say in the book, I continue to... You're
not advocating it, you're just saying think about it.
I hover on that brink. I think it would be a terribly grave step to take. And for myself, and there's a kind of distinction here between one's persona as an analyst and one's persona as a voter. For myself, if it transpires that in order to sustain an independent strategic posture, we have to go nuclear, that would be a very significant factor pushing me towards the New Zealand option.
And yet again, to come back to one of the points we discussed in one of the earlier versions of this interview, that again is a very different Australia we're describing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Australians are very used to thinking of themselves as a middle power. But that's because being a middle power has been easy, because we've always had the backing of a great and powerful friend. We've never had to test the proposition that we can stand up to a great power without the backing of another great power, because we've always had the backing of another great power. So Australia really now does, classic situation, we have to define what kind of country we want to be, and sad though it might be, one of the ways we define that is defining our strategic and military posture.
St. Augustine got it right. It's a tough choice to make.
Certainly is.
Thank you, Hugh White.